My name is Vinod Jain, and I'm a senior analyst at Aite-Novarica Group. And I'm joined by distinguished members from the industry to discuss about this discussion on T+1. I think we have Lieven from Euroclear, Kristoffer from Euronext, Bill from IHS Markit, and I think John Abel from DTCC. I think he's having some technical issues of not being able to join this remotely. So I think we have a short time, and I think I do understand that this is another session which is between the members and the drinks for networking. So I think let's just get directly into the discussion. So I think so much has been written and talked about T+1. I think industry has progressed from T+3 to T+2, moving on towards to T+1, at least in the US market over here. And even though it looks a change, which is a bigger change, I think there are various dimensions associated with this, because it does not only impact a smaller set of asset class, it impacts all the asset class which are in scope at a DTCC in the US. So the number of products goes beyond just a traditional equity stocks over here. And I think that's the bigger change, because if you're looking at a change across more than around, say, 25 different DTCC eligible products, the impact to a financial institution as well as to the market infrastructure is huge. And I think one of the critical elements which we also looked at was the whole aspects around the allocation process, which would need to be tightened further to have a same-day allocations to be able to process the trade for settlement on T+1 basis. So I think with that, let's kick off with that discussion around allocation. So maybe Lieven, Kristoffer, or Bill, if you want to share your thoughts around how do you look at the allocation process? What are you trying to do in this process, or how do you look at to have the allocation to be processed on the same day to meet the settlement obligations of T+1?
Thanks, Vinod. Yes, so allocations in the US, primarily, you've got to get the allocation to your custodian, but before you can do that, you have to get it matched. You have to make sure all the details are correct, and then you instruct it down to your custodian, or it can go directly to DTC. So today, some of the research that we've done over the last few months, there are legacy systems in the US that may not be able to cope with this. So if there are any legacy batch processes that will require a change, there's not that much of a time to be able to enact that change. The systems need to be real time. You need to get back information about any issues with the allocation process as quickly as possible so that you can make those amendments and get them down to allow for settlement on T+1. So a lot of trading is done at the start of the day, but also at the end of the day in the US. So if you're trading at the end of the day and you haven't found out that you've got that problem, you run an overnight batch, then you'll find out that you have the problem. Getting that in and fixed, and a batch rerun is going to cause some of the firms in the US a lot of problems. So it's something that firms do need to think about over the course of the next 2 or 3 years to make sure that they are ready for that T+1 change.
I think interesting you mentioned about getting the allocations in time, and I think if most of the trading has been done towards the start of the day or towards the end of the day, I think we may see a shift towards more getting the trades being executed towards at least by the midday, so that it gives more time for the allocations to be processed.
You may do, but some funds trade towards the end of the day, so it may not be possible to trade in the middle of the day. You've also got firms on the West Coast as well, so that's definitely going to impact timelines as well. Even if they trade in the middle of their day, it's 3 hours different to New York, so it's still probably going to be towards the end of the New York day.
Good, agree with that. Anyone else has any other comments? Kristoffer or Lieven?
No, but I think I'm not going to speak about the trade allocation part. That's clearly beyond our remit. But while it's, of course, interesting to already look into that kind of practical aspects, if we move a bit from US to Europe, I thought it was also interesting to sort of talk a bit about what is actually needed in Europe to move ahead, because obviously in the US you have been looking into this for a while. I think there has been for more than a year now really market working groups, steering committees, so you guys are ahead, and so the question is a bit what is needed in Europe for us to sort of make this move as well. I think what is still missing for the moment, at least that's my impression, is a buy-in from the market. I think everybody says it's a good idea to be aligned with the US. Nobody will disagree that it's a good idea to have less risk or to reduce the collateral requirements, but it needs to move from this is not a bad idea to how are we going to get organized to do it. And on that aspect, I think one observation that I had was that in Europe, T+2 is actually a regulatory requirement. The move from T+3 to T+2 that we had in 2015 was driven by a piece of European regulation. And at the same time, we had T2S, which is always good to have a big infrastructure project to help move the market. In the US, as I understand it, it's a market practice. So it makes a lot of sense for DTCC as the place of settlement to actually, take the lead and say, well, why don't we move to T+1? So the question is, can we just copy-paste that approach here in Europe, or do we need to consider, okay, what would be the best approach on our side? And I think there it's important that, in addition to EXDA, the voice of the CSDs, that we have all the other organizations representing buy-side, sell-side, to actually also embrace this if we want this to happen.
I completely agree with that. I think just continuing on the thread around the regulations requirement, I think one of the driver was around, even in US, there was a change required from SEC to initiate the rules so that it can be mandated around a T+1. And I think the move from T+3 to T+2 was more with respect to the cost efficiency of clearing. And I think the move from T+2 to T+1 is more aligned to reducing the settlement risk as well as the margins which needs to be posted, and the experience which we have seen in the market during the turbulent times of the meme stocks happening. So coming to the market infrastructure on the European side over here, if something similar events such as this happens in the European segment, how do you look at the market infrastructure or the clearing houses? Are they able to cope up with those kind of fluctuations which would be required to initiate the settlement risk or to mitigate the settlement risk?
Yeah. I think that it's important to stress that the market infrastructures as such, at least the main majority, already supports T+1 and even T+0. In the Euronext markets, at least, we support it, or especially leveraged by T2S. We know that other markets does it as well. So I think it's not so much the infrastructure side that we need to look into. So we were actually discussing, we need a market participant here on the panel to have a discussion with them around the actual benefits. I think that we will be ready to support it already today, but we need to understand the actual drivers for going into such a change. I fully agree with what you say, Lieven. We see some benefits in the US around risk reduction, cost reduction. It's a different setup that we have in the US compared to Europe. So do we see the same over here? Can that really be the trigger to spend so much money, make that upfront investment to go into T+1? We had the panel debate just before. Our good fellow from Goldman Sachs, he was quite clear on, does this really bring value short term? I think that we need to look into CSDR, the penalty mechanism, making sure that we have everything in place in that aspect before moving into T+1. It's a massive change that we need to change, and not just on the infrastructure side, but from the buyer side to the custodians. We need to have everything in place. Processes needs to be automated, because if we don't have that, we will just see that we will have more fails. And that will not be to the benefit of anyone.
Yeah, to just link with the discussion before. Sorry, you were not there. I'm assuming Vinod. But if we see how many problems, operational problems, the implementation of CSDR has caused, and we've been working on that for I don't know how many years, and in a way that you could say that it's a relatively small subset of what needs to happen. This is an indication of how complex this can be to actually move to T+1 in view of everybody who's involved in the chain, and it's definitely not realistic to do it in 2-3 years, which I think is very ambitious of our American colleagues.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think Exeter published a couple of stats last week. So for February, the first month of CSDR, there was an 8% fail rate across the market, which is very high. And I think they said that they issued about 10 million penalties because of CSDR in the first month. So I would argue that we're not ready quite yet. And a lot of work needs to be done on the efficiency side to get us to a point where it makes sense that you can continue with the process and evolve it so that you don't cause another spike in fails and CSDR penalties. I assume they'll still be around at that point.
So I think considering the consensus seems to be that the US will go ahead with the T+1, I think the European segment may take more time to stabilize on the CSDR process and then consider via a regulation approach to move to T+1. Bill, how do you look at all the other post-trade functions, especially around the corporate actions, which could be impacted due to a regime wherein on one side we have a T+1 settlement, on the other side of the pond we would have the T+2 settlements, and especially more for the, you could say, the dual-listed securities. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'll touch on those. There's obviously other issues that are out there, but the cross-border ones, you will have two different settlement cycles. So if you're moving a security from the US to Europe, which cycle do you use? Is it T1 or T2? So that's something that needs to be looked at. But I think more fundamentally on the corporate action side, to have the X date and the record date as the same date, it's going to cause more issues in that time frame. So there needs to be a lot more work done then. And again, you need to then move to a real-time system like IM Securities and IM Actions. They have that real-time processing so that you can process things as it's received and deal with the data in the right way.
And there is the broader question of what securities will be in scope. I think in the US the focus is on the equity markets, on some bond markets. I think earlier was also referred to what do you do, for example, with investment funds. If you're going to create a desynchronization between the asset side and the liability side, what do you do with ETFs that for some of the secondary market settlement they need a redemption or a creation of security? So it's as I'm sure you have thought about all of that in the US. We haven't yet, but so we see that there's this can get quite big in terms of impact.
Sure.
Sorry,
Absolutely.
just to add, Vinod, I think what it will lead to is there will be a need for some clients to pre-fund that market. So, especially in the Asia and maybe even to the east of Europe, you are going to need to be able to have that US dollar available. So, if you're selling out of another market to go into the US, it will mean that you are out of the market for that day, and you're either going to be lucky or unlucky in that something could happen in that market. If it massively spikes the day you're out of it, then obviously that's going to impact returns as well.
Sure. I think just looking at the operational aspect of it, I think you did mention about the impact across larger asset class. And I think when it's a larger change, and also impacting a huge amount of trade processing across various asset class, how do you define the various controls which needs to be built in as part of the process? And what kind of demands are you looking at from your clients to understand that what's the impact of this T+1 migration on the day-to-day processing side?
So I think all of your data, the foundational things that you need to have in place to get things settled on time, to handle corporate actions, you have to have real-time processing around all of those. If you have any type of batch process, or if you don't have the right process to handle data, then it's going to cause issue with settlements. It's going to cause issue with corporate actions. So I think you have to make sure that you've got the fundamentals right to be able to accommodate a T+1 cycle. I think the move from T+3 to T+2, it went very well, but you have an extra day in that process. You're now looking to take out potentially the whole of a business day. If you trade at the end of one day and you have to settle the next day, you're supposed to have the trade out there and ready for settlement at the start of the following day, so T+1. If you haven't been able to sort your process out, then there will definitely be an impact in terms of settlement efficiency if you're not ready for it.
Yeah. And even within, because we talk about days, but I think even within the day, I would see that probably in most markets, and especially in the Swedish market, we will need to extend the opening hours, the settlement window of the day. And that has typically very quickly a lot of impact. A lot of clients have end-of-day processes. If, for example, we look at the Swedish market, the settlement day closes, and then you have all the processes around the collateral to do with the central bank money. So probably the central bank will need to extend their opening hours. So even if you stay within the same day, and if you have real-time systems, I think you will need them open and running much longer than they currently do.
I also think it's important to stress that, as we also talked about just before, do we have the market demand? Right now in Euronext Securities and all 4 markets, we don't have any clients really pushing us to go into a T+1 regime. Of course, the clients discussing it, I think very much, you would say, driven by the move in US and the discussions coming from the US. So of course, there are discussions in Exeter and so forth. But we don't really see that push. Maybe it's due to CSTR having had so much focus. I think that's, of course, one key driver. But so it will be quite interesting to see what will happen now when we have seen the penalty regime being introduced for quite some time. But we need to really understand the benefits and then what needs to be introduced in order for us to have an operational setup. Because as we said, okay, we can be pretty bold to say, okay, from an infrastructure point of view, we support it. We can do it today. That's very much inside out. But I think that we could go into discussions with our clients asking, okay, how can we improve? Because I fully agree, reconciliation, real time, but it could also be liquidity dashboards. We just introduced that in Milan and looking into expanding that to the Nordics. That could, for instance, be one way to help our clients improving in a T+1 regime. So I still think that even though that we can support it operationally, we can still look into having services around a T+1 daily operations.
As I think you did mention about having the operational controls on the user interface screens over here. And I think that's one of the prominent things which we always look for, trying to understand that how do you build the various controls on the dashboard for anyone to look at it, what actions needs to be taken. Because I think if the securities are moving across so many different systems and across the market infrastructure players over here at any point of time, how would you know what to be corrected or what not to be corrected? And this impacts a larger scope of, as we mentioned, about all the products which would be in scope for the T+1 regime, at least in the US side over here. How would you look at what's happening? I think one of the dashboard which you just mentioned, any other demands, what you have seen from your clients, trying to understand what should be the impact of the T+1 settlement migrations?
Yeah, so I think workflow dashboards and all that type of thing, it definitely will be needed. So the custodians, the depositories, they all send information in slightly different formats. Even if it's supposedly in a standardized Swift message, you still get the standard message information, but there can be other information in there. So you need to be able to take that in, translate it into the real information, look at the error codes, and investigate the reasons. You need to be able to do that very quickly, work out whether the problem is something that you've caused by putting it in incorrectly, or whether it's something your counterparty's done, and then you need a way to communicate with your counterparty as quickly as you can to make sure that they correct their side of the instruction. So I think those workflow dashboards that show you the exceptions that you have is something that clients should be using today anyway. But I think over time, as the settlement deadlines, the settlement timelines shorten, will be needed to make sure that you stay on top of any issues that are going on in the market.
Sure. Just looking at the different aspect over here, what will be the EU market infrastructure? I would say the view on the settlement risk over here in terms of what should be the adoption strategy. Should the migration to T+1 should be skipped completely and embrace the DLT platforms, which would have more of, I would say, at least a promising layer of T+0 or T+1 settlements. Given the European market infrastructure has invested so much of time in the T2S settlement, as well as followed by the various regulations around MiFID II, ESMA, and now CSDR. Just trying to find out the appetite of the European market infrastructure to invest more into moving from T+2 to T+1, or skip the layer of this whole migration and wait for the real benefit coming from the DLT platforms, actually.
Well, I guess when we talk about these kind of investments that will spread out over years, and at the same time we see that DLT is no longer just a buzzword to be mentioned at any panel, at any conference, but you see more and more that moves from experimentation to commercialization. And at the same time, if you look at some of the potential benefits of DLT, which are typically around cutting out intermediaries, I think one of the challenges we see in T+1 is that you have this entire sequential chain, which inevitably takes a lot of time. DLT would allow every party to connect directly to the core, so you would save time there. And at the same time, when you say DLT in terms of settlement, typically you talk about immediate settlement. So when you have that in the back of your mind, yes, I think people will have to ask the question, do we want to spend a lot of time, effort, resources into an intermediate step, or is there a possibility to immediately go to the final step? But at the same time, like you mentioned, we have T2S, which is the settlement system for most of the European markets. I'm not aware of any concrete plans for them to move to DLT either. So that's why this is a discussion that needs to be taken at broader level. But I think it would be amiss not to ask at least the question.
But I think that you touch upon something quite important, that T2S doesn't really operate DLT. And if this has to work, it needs to be all or none. It doesn't really make sense that some market participants or some markets go into a T+1 or T+0 regime and some others stays on T+2. So I think that the short-term answer is no, I don't really see that DLT will be, you could say, the thing coming in and then making us settle T+0 in a short-term basis at least. And then we should all agree that, okay, this will be done in 10 years' time or something like that. If it all needs to make big investments to go into a DLT regime, that really makes us all work together more integrated. Personally, I don't really see that happening short term.
Sure.
I'm going to plagiarize an analogy that somebody did at a prior conference. So they were talking about running a marathon. It takes about 2 hours to run a marathon. But if you're suddenly told you've got to run that
wow,
that's my time. I don't know but if you're suddenly told you've got to run the marathon in an hour, unless you change something fundamentally, you cannot do that. So I think you're right. I'm not sure. There are some markets that are going into DLT, so I'm not sure it's fully ready now. But I think, like you say, it'd be remiss if we didn't look at that step change. And if there is a way that you can incorporate a DLT process to allow for that change to be skipped and to go straight to T0, then that could be something that would benefit the European market. There are markets like the Hong Kong Exchange that are looking at that now. Australia's looking at it. So there are depositories and exchanges out there that are looking at that. But I think there will be a period of time, to your point, that you're going to have to combine the two systems. You can't just go to a pure DLT. It's going to have to interact with the traditional system for quite some time. But I think there are things that you could do to like you say, have a 10-year vision, but do it in the right process so that you get to a point where you do move on to DLT, and maybe then you can miss out T+1 and the double expense. You know, if you pay for all this money to get to T+1 and then start talking about T0, you're going to have to spend again. I think the other piece of that is there's a lot of efficiency with netting and all. You know, we've got a lot of the CCPs here. I think it might not be an atomic settlement on T0, so you may not have to have the securities and the cash at that point, but there may need to be something done then to make sure that you don't lose some of the efficiencies that we already have with the CCPs.
Any other thoughts from the panel members? I think, Bill, you mentioned about something interesting, which I just caught up with. You said about the traditional systems as well as the DLT systems. And I think that seems to be the future coming up more from the securities processing side, that you would have efficiencies being brought up in the existing traditional infrastructure, market infrastructure. At the same time, there would be another operating model coming up or to process the same thing on the DLT platforms. And somewhere down the line, both of them needs to have some kind of a connection, or I would say a combination coming up together to link those two operating models in some form or some shape from them. I think, say go ahead.
No, I think obviously the disruption model sounds good, but our business is very much about security. It's about reliability, so that doesn't really, coincide well with disruption. So I think we will anyway have to evolve towards a model where you will at a certain moment have the two technologies running alongside to allow a smooth transition. You will not one day kill your old system and move to a DLT system. It will be a gradual, pieces of it will be available in new technology and will link up with the old technology. I think that's what you see in the market with some of the use cases. That's typically what's being done.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think you have to. It's part of that plan. If you are going to move into that type of model, then you have to get ready, but you have to take into account the current system. I think it needs to be more of a partnership than a disruption. It needs to be a migration towards a better model that the parties are still involved in and get the information from.
And you could also ask, should DLT be introduced due to T+1 or due to other benefits? I think that T+1 cannot really, you could say, drive the change into DLT setup across Europe. I think we need other things that supports it. And again, sure. I think it's very much about what does our clients want. What really brings value? And you said it previously, we need to have the discussions in Europe, in the forums that we have, the groups that we have, to really understand the benefits, and then we can start working, you could say, towards the goal of T+1 if the market wants it.
Sure. Any specific demands, what you have seen from the European market infrastructure, giving it to DTCC so that they could provide more lights in terms of what needs to be considered by the European market infrastructure?
Vinod, we're staring at a red screen that has a flashing 0.
Oh, okay.
So we're basically out of time, I think. That was a neat way to
no worries, no worries. I'm just here. Yeah, it's red. It is red. Okay. No, but please, the question. Is there anyone who wants to know? Sorry.
So I know we've spoken a couple of times, and we've not heard the demand at this stage. That may change over time, and especially if the US does move to T+1, it may be a driver for the European conversation to continue. But I think has been talked about already. I think people need to get through CSDR and allow that to smooth itself out, and then maybe the T+1 discussions can start, and we can work out whether there's a real benefit to the industry over here in Europe.
Well, on that, I would then ask, whether if now the US goes ahead, isn't it, as I actually said myself this morning, that it's necessary that Europe follows? That's the way. It was the other way around last time. US had to follow Europe. So can we actually should we have a situation where we do separate settlement?
We may do. I don't believe that we've had the conversations yet that would allow us to commit to the same time frame that they've committed to. So,
but maybe not the same time frame, but at least sort of start working on it.
Yeah,
I think it was about 2 years difference between US and Europe last time. So maybe.
Yeah, and it may be the same this time, the other way around though. Yeah.
True.
I think it's one of the worst challenges we have, T+1 coming up now, as you're already alluding to. So it's going to be. That your marathon seems to be an easy task.
Keep practicing.
2 hours, my God. Any questions to the panelists? Yes, we have a number of hands here. Now we start running with the microphone.
You did say this would be the interesting session.
Very, very interesting question. Alex Krunic from LCH. Bill, I can do the marathon in 2 hours on my bike or in my car. Couple of observations. So obviously, Bill, you mentioned moving to T+2 from T+3 or beyond to T+2. That took over a decade. And the one issue you will have if there's a kind of stagnant approach on moving to T+1 is unless all the markets are on the same settlement cycle, you can't multilaterally net. That's the first. In terms of the benefits, you mentioned the key benefits of reducing the settlement cycle is obviously your counterparty risk. You're reducing from, effectively from a 2-day open risk to a single-day open risk. And as a CCP, we've kind of looked at different studies on this. And more importantly for our clients, when you're moving from T+2 to T+1, there will be a reduction in margin of probably 40 to 45%. Again, our clients are able to deploy that capital elsewhere. Now, the question I have for you, this is yet another project, and I think, Bill, you're right. In terms of the US is a vertical, right? Single currency, single CSD, single, it's easy, right? For us in Europe, we've got multiple. Who's going to pay for this? Because for the infrastructures themselves, they're going to be the ones bearing the cost up front. How do you envisage they're going to pass that cost on to the users of the infrastructures? Short question.
Somebody will definitely pay. I would imagine it will come down to the underlying clients. The fees will stay high. one of the reasons for doing it would be to make the fees cheaper, maybe more on a par with what the US are charged today. But this probably will delay all of that until we get to a point where we've implemented it, we've paid for it, and then maybe the fees start to go down. So it may be quite some time, but I think the investors in the European market will continue to pay for it.
So, but I guess that's who will pay for it, but then also who gets to share in the benefit. If we're saying, okay, for some people it means less collateral, that's a cost saving. Will they pass that on to their end client? So that's interesting questions.
I have a question in regards to FX. When we moved from T+3 to T+2, it was in line with the FX schedule. So is the FX market in line with this? And if not, do they have to? And if not, what's the impact?
It's quite interesting. The SEC paper that looked at FX basically got the can and kicked it quite firmly down the road and said the participants that trade FX need to look at what they need to do to cope with it. So there wasn't any answer in the SEC paper. So it is something that absolutely needs to be looked at. It's a huge disconnect between the current processes.
I have a question down there as well.
Sure. Oh, this is working. Don't worry. Virginie from Firebrand. When you talk about jumping to T+0, I find myself scratching my head and wondering why on earth that's better than what we've got now in terms of reducing risk. Obviously, real-time gross settlement is one thing, right? If we're going to go DLT and think real-time gross settlement, then we're exposing ourselves to having bilateral risk. Risk never disappears; it transforms, right? So why do we always have to think about these things in that term? I think sometimes technology, yes, it's there. It's not always the way that we're going to solve our problems, right? And that's something I think we should always consider in these matters. Certainly the SEC is talking about T+0 in a netted version, not real-time gross settlement. So just a point I wanted to make on that front.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. The risk isn't going to go away. If you have something wrong in the process, it's still going to cause a problem. It doesn't matter if it's T2, T1, or T0. I think it comes back down to that, the investigation of the benefits. If the companies that are involved, the depositories, the regulators don't see a benefit from moving to T+2 to T1 or even T0, then we shouldn't do it. There's got to be a real benefit for everyone, and it could be the risk reduction from T2 to T1 is enough. T0 and netting during the day on T0 could be a huge benefit, but it's how we get there. It's not going to be a quick road. It's going to be a long and windy road.
But I don't think anybody disagrees, and it's like what is mentioned earlier. It's technology should serve the business need and not the other way around. And so I wasn't saying that because DLT can do immediate or atomic settlement, that's what we should have. It's just that it's part of that technology, so that should be part of the thinking process. But definitely there's a lot of benefits in, like Bill said, in netting that we shouldn't lose, basically.